Welcome to today's deep dive. We are really thrilled to have you here with us.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Today, we're exploring a piece of history that is, well, it's incredibly intense. It's layered, and it is still at the absolute center of fierce international debate.
Right.
This isn't just a standard history lesson about, dates and treaties. This is really an exploration of how modern nations are forged from the ashes of empires, how millions of people are uprooted overnight, and how the labels we put on historical events, the actual specific words we choose to use, they matter deeply, even a full century later.
That is exactly the right lens to view this through. To give you some context on the foundation of our conversation today, we're analyzing an extensive encyclopedia entry on the events surrounding the Ottoman Greek population between the years 1913 and 1923.
Yeah, it's a massive amount of information.
It is. It's a dense compilation of primary eyewitness accounts, diplomatic cables, and modern academic analysis. And it paints a picture of a world in total transition.
And really, the mission of this deep dive is to guide you through that timeline. We are going to explore the incredibly complex geopolitical fallout of the Ottoman Empire's collapse. And we want to unpack that highly charged, ongoing debate over how to define what happened to the people living there.
Which is still heavily debated.
Exactly. But to grasp the magnitude of the collapse, we really have to understand what this region actually looked like before everything fell apart, because it wasn't what it looks like today.
Not at all. It's essential to understand that before World War I, Asia Minor, which is roughly modern-day Turkey, it was a deeply, deeply diverse region.
Right.
It was not ethnically or religiously homogenous. You had Turks, Armenians, Kurds, Assyrians, Jews, and many others living side by side in this vast imperial territory. And the Greek presence there was ancient.
Very ancient.
We are talking about roots dating back to the late Bronze Age, around 1450 BC.
So long before the events of the 20th century.
Millennia before. This was the land of Homer, the land of early philosophers like Heraclitus. Through the Roman and Byzantine empires, the indigenous inhabitants primarily practiced Orthodox Christianity, and they spoke Greek.
Yes.
Even after the Ottoman Turks conquered the region in the 15th century, that Greek culture remained deeply embedded. They became a minority under Turkic rule, but their towns, their commerce, their culture, it was completely woven into the fabric of the region.
Cool, but let's unpack this. We have this ancient, diverse, multi-ethnic society. But as we move into the early 20th century, specifically the years just before World War I, so around 1913 to 1914, a massive ideological shift happens.
It's a huge shift.
The Ottoman Empire is fading. They have just suffered devastating territorial losses in the Balkan Wars. And, driven by a rising tide of nationalism, the government begins viewing this indigenous Christian Greek population not as neighbors, but as a literal existential threat.
Yes, the political atmosphere just becomes a pressure cooker. The government at the time was led by a group called the Committee of Union and Progress. You might know them historically as the Young Turks.
Right, the Young Turks.
Their mindset shifted to the idea that to form a modern, secure country in an era of aggressive nationalism, the empire needed to purge minorities who might sympathize with the empire's European enemies. To achieve this, the government adopted a strategy that historians describe as a dual-track mechanism.
A dual-track mechanism. It sounds incredibly bureaucratic, but when you look at how it played out on the ground, it's actually the birth of modern, plausible deniability in state-sponsored violence.
That is a perfect way to describe it. The dual-track mechanism meant combining official public state policies with unofficial extra-legal terror.
Wow.
On one track, the government would issue official acts of relocation. They'd tell the international community, hey, we are just moving these populations for military necessity, or it's a standard security policy.
Right. Keeping it strictly professional on paper.
Exactly. But on the parallel, hidden track, they utilized covert terror campaigns carried out by irregular groups. Specifically, a shadowy paramilitary wing known as the Special Organization.
Basically, state-sponsored death squads.
That's what they were. This gave the central government complete plausible deniability. They could empty out Christian villages through sheer terror, and when foreign ambassadors complained about the violence, the state could simply throw up its hands and deny any prior knowledge.
Blaming local bandits.
Yes, blame the rogue actors, all while pulling the strings behind the scenes.
And the historical records give us a chilling, detailed example of exactly how this dual-track system operated. In June 1914, there was an attack on Phokia, which was a prosperous town in western Anatolia.
A very prosperous town.
Turkish irregular troops completely destroyed the city. Dozens of civilians were killed, and the entire surviving population was forced to flee for their lives to Greece. And we know definitively that this wasn't just random mob violence because of a French eyewitness, Charles Mancier.
Mancier's accounts are so crucial here. He was a French diplomat who was there on the ground, and he explicitly stated that the atrocities were highly organized.
Methodical.
Very methodical. He described how these irregular forces purposefully aimed to circle and drive out the Christian peasant populations.
And alongside these direct attacks, the state also implemented what were called Labor Battalions. They would conscript Greek men of military age, but instead of giving them weapons, they sent them hundreds of miles into the harsh Anatolian interior.
Just brutal conditions.
They forced them to work on roads and tunnels until they literally dropped. Hundreds of thousands died in these battalions due to starvation, exposure, and outright massacre by their guards.
It was essentially a death sentence disguised as civic duty. And it's worth noting that around the same time, there were actually early attempts at voluntary population exchanges between Greece and the Ottoman Empire.
Oh, really? Voluntary?
Yes, they signed an agreement in 1914 to swap some Muslim populations living in Greece for Greek populations in Anatolia. But the outbreak of World War I stopped that bureaucratic process in its tracks, replacing it with the brutal mechanics of imperial collapse.
So the war just accelerates everything.
It does. A fading empire, terrified of being carved up by foreign powers, often resorts to extreme, violent homogenization. They believed that removing the Greek and Armenian populations was the absolute prerequisite for the empire's survival.
So you have this powder keg of nationalism and secret paramilitary squads, and then in 1914, the rest of the world catches fire. World War I breaks out, and suddenly this internal Ottoman policy becomes a massive global geopolitical issue.
It certainly does.
Because Eleftherios Venizelos, the leader of Greece, starts playing a very high-stakes game of chess.
He absolutely does. Venizelos threatened to drop Greece's neutrality and join the Entente, the Allies, or to retaliate against Muslims living in Greece if the persecution of Greeks in Anatolia didn't stop.
That is a massive threat.
And this diplomatic threat actually worked briefly. It caused Germany, who was the primary ally of the Ottomans, to demand that the Ottoman government halt the persecutions. Germany really didn't want Greece entering the war against them.
But did the violence actually stop? Or did the Ottoman government just tell Germany what they wanted to hear?
What's fascinating here is how the central official policy supposedly changed to appease an ally, but the grim mechanics of history just kept grinding forward on the ground.
So they ignored the orders.
Pretty much. Despite central orders from Constantinople to halt, the local massacres and deportations continued largely unpunished. The state policy just shifted its justification. They began forcefully moving Greeks from coastal areas, particularly the Black Sea region, deep into the Anatolian hinterland.
And what was their excuse this time?
Claiming these populations were a military vulnerability who might aid a Russian naval attack.
And what about the Germans? I mean, they were military allies stationed right there in the Ottoman Empire. Did they just turn a blind eye to this?
It goes well beyond turning a blind eye. The historical archives reveal that German military officials themselves became directly complicit.
Wow.
You have German General Lehmann von Sanders, who was advising the Ottoman military, directly ordering the deportation of 30,000 Greeks from the town of Ayvalık in March 1917.
30,000 people.
And this wasn't a peaceful relocation. This operation involved death marches, the mass looting of property, and the massacre of the civilian population.
The internal communications from the diplomats stationed there at the time are just staggering to read. Sweden's ambassador to Constantinople in 1917, Kosva Ankersvärd, wrote a report noting that the cruelty of extending these deportations to women and children was done specifically to make it easier to confiscate their property.
Right.
It wasn't about security. It was about eradicating a presence and taking what they left behind.
And you can hear the stark reality of the situation in the private observations of the officials involved. The German chancellor at the time, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, stated plainly in 1917, he said, "The indications are that the Turks plan to eliminate the Greek element as enemies of the state, as they did earlier with the Armenians."
That's a direct quote.
Yes. He detailed how they displaced people into the interior, exposing them to death and hunger, and then looted their homes.
Even the Ottoman officials themselves were brutally clear behind closed doors. An Austrian consul in 1916 reported a conversation with an Ottoman official named Refet Bey. They reportedly said, "We must finish off the Greeks as we did with the Armenians. Today I sent squads to the interior to kill every Greek on sight."
Just horrific.
The international diplomat stationed there actually coined a term for this specific type of atrocity, these deportations involving death marches and starvation camps. They called them white massacres.
A chilling term. Death by attrition, exposure, and exhaustion, rather than a firing squad. But it is also important to note that this wasn't entirely a one-sided slaughter without pushback.
Right, there was resistance.
Yes, the Pontic Greeks, those living along the Black Sea coast, responded by forming insurgent groups. By 1920, they had an 18,000-man resistance force in the Caucasus, fighting alongside Russian units against the Ottoman army to safeguard the withdrawal of Greek refugees.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because World War I ends in 1918. The Ottoman Empire capitulates to the Allies. But the end of the global war does not mean the end of the violence in this region.
Not at all.
A new force rises from the ashes of the empire, the Turkish national movement, led by Mustafa Kemal, who would later be known as Ataturk. And this leads us directly into the Greco-Turkish War.
Yes. The period immediately following World War I, from 1919 to 1922, was marked by intense, devastating mutual violence. The Allies had promised Greece territorial gains in Anatolia as a reward for joining the war.
So they move in.
Right. So in May 1919, Hellenic or Greek troops landed at the city of Smyrna, a major port city with a massive Greek population.
And when looking at this period, we want to emphasize to you listening that we are just reporting the source material impartially here. Historians emphasize that the chaos resulted in horrific atrocities committed by both sides. When the Greek military occupied western Anatolia, the records showed devastating massacres of the local Turkish populations.
Precisely. The British historian Arnold J. Toynbee wrote extensively on this mutual tragedy. He noted that the Greek military landings in Smyrna were actually the catalyst that ignited Mustafa Kemal's Turkish national movement.
It gave them an enemy to rally against.
Exactly, a unifying foreign invader to fight. Toynbee pointed out that both the Greeks of Pontus and the Turks of the Greek-occupied territories were victims of original political miscalculations made by leaders sitting in boardrooms far away in Paris.
This is a profound tragedy where civilian populations on both sides paid the ultimate price for the political ambitions of their leaders. And this mutual violence reached a terrifying climax with the Great Fire of Smyrna in September 1922, after the Turkish forces recaptured the city.
A truly dark moment in history.
The chaos at the docks, as hundreds of thousands of people tried to flee the flames and the advancing army, is one of the most harrowing scenes of the 20th century. Estimates of the death toll for Greeks and Armenians who perished in the fire and the accompanying massacres range from 10,000 to 100,000 dead, with up to 200,000 expelled.
And tens of thousands of able-bodied men who couldn't escape were deported to the interior, most of whom died or were executed. This brutal, decade-long chapter finally reached a formal resolution with the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923.
Which fundamentally redrew the demographic map of the world.
It did. The treaty formalized a massive compulsory population exchange between Greece and Turkey.
And let's be clear about what a compulsory population exchange actually means.
Yeah.
That is a highly sanitized bureaucratic term for forced mass deportation.
Absolutely. Over 1.1 million Ottoman Greeks were packed up and permanently expelled to Greece, leaving behind homes their families had lived in for generations.
And on the other side.
Simultaneously, hundreds of thousands of Muslims living in Greece were forcibly sent to Turkey. This exchange abruptly and permanently ended millennia of continuous Greek ethnic presence in Asia Minor.
And the human cost of this decade of violence is just staggering. The academic estimates for the Ottoman Greek death toll between 1914 and 1922 vary heavily depending on the parameters of the research.
Right, the numbers differ.
Scholar Rudolf Rummel estimates around 347,000. Political scientist Adam Jones suggests 750,000. And researchers like Thea Halo, when accounting for a broader timeline and region, estimate up to 1.2 million deaths.
It's an immense loss of life.
So what does this all mean? How do we categorize violence on this scale? This brings us to a fierce modern debate over a single word: genocide. The word itself didn't even exist when these events happened. It was coined in the 1940s by a Polish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin.
Yes, Lemkin was trying to create a legal framework for the destruction of a nation or an ethnic group. And in his early writings defining what genocide was, Lemkin specifically detailed the fate of the Greeks in Turkey alongside the Armenians as a prime historical example of the crime he was trying to name.
But the debate over whether to officially apply this label today is where the academic and political spheres deeply fracture. Again, staying entirely impartial with the sources here, can you break down the dividing lines in this academic debate?
Certainly. On one side, you have institutions like the International Association of Genocide Scholars, or IAGS. In 2007, they passed a resolution overwhelmingly affirming that the campaign against the Ottoman Greeks was a genocide, qualitatively similar to the Armenian genocide.
And some governments agree with that.
Yes, several nations, including the US, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Austria, have passed resolutions officially recognizing it as such.
But there is a very prominent counter-argument within the academic community, right? Scholars who argue that while the events were horrific, they don't meet the strict legal definition of genocide.
Correct. You have prominent scholars like Manis Midlarsky, Michael Schwartz, and Andrekos Varnava who argue that this was ethnic cleansing or deportation, but not genocide.
Because of the legal definition.
Right. Their argument hinges on intent and outcome. They point out a disjunction between the violent rhetoric of some Ottoman officials and the actual overarching goals of the state. They argue that because of the strong cultural and political ties the Ottoman Greeks had with European powers, total biological annihilation simply wasn't a viable option for the Ottomans.
So it was more about moving them out of strategic areas.
Exactly. These scholars point to the fact that the massacres were often contained to sensitive border regions, and ultimately over 1 million Greeks survived the war to be exchanged in 1923. Therefore, they classify it as a ruthless campaign of ethnic cleansing designed to homogenize the state rather than an attempted biological eradication of the entire Greek race.
And the political pushback on this terminology is immense. When the Greek parliament passed laws in the 1990s affirming the events as genocide, the Turkish government's official response was swift and angry. They released a statement claiming the genocide label is without any historical basis.
Very strong words.
They accused Greece of distorting history and covering up the massacres Greece perpetrated in Anatolia, claiming the resolution displayed an expansionist Greek mentality.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can see how international law and geopolitical alliances deeply complicate historical memory. Think about how often you see this today. Nations turning a blind eye to human rights abuses because they need a military base, a trade deal, or a strategic partner. That exact dynamic is what buried this history for decades.
Right, because why hasn't the United Nations or the European Parliament universally recognized it?
Well, the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne essentially sealed the end of the conflict with an amnesty declaration, avoiding any massive war crimes trials. Then you have the Cold War. Following World War II, Greece and Turkey were both critical NATO allies facing a common communist enemy in the Soviet Union.
They needed each other.
Geopolitics demanded they be partners, not adversaries fighting over historical grievances. Acknowledging a genocide threatened that delicate diplomatic balance, so the international community largely stayed silent.
It's wild how the present needs of governments dictate how the past is officially remembered. But there's one more piece of this deep dive that is truly bizarre, and it connects this regional conflict to the darkest chapter of the 20th century. Research by historian Stefan Ihrig shows that the Nazi Party in Germany in the 1920s viewed Mustafa Kemal and the New Turkey as a literal role model.
It is a profoundly dark inspiration. The Nazi press continually praised the cleansing of the Greeks and Armenians as a prerequisite for creating a strong, unified national state.
It's hard to even process that.
In 1921, the official Nazi newspaper stated that the German nation would one day have to resort to Turkish methods. Adolf Hitler himself later referred to Kemal as his star in the darkness and considered himself a student of the Turkish leader's nation-building tactics.
But the historical record reveals an incredible paradox here. Hitler idolized Kemal for his ruthless homogenization of a country. But how did Kemal actually view Hitler and the Nazis? Because the feeling was definitely not mutual.
This raises an important question about how extreme regimes weaponize and distort history. The irony is profound. Despite Hitler's intense admiration in 1933, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk actually granted asylum to thousands of Jewish scientists and academics who were fleeing Nazi repression, employing them at Turkish universities to modernize the country.
He actively worked against Hitler's goals.
Yes. Kemal publicly called Mussolini a clown, and he referred to Hitler as a maniac corporal and a dangerous racist. He thought Nazism was a direct threat to Europe.
It just shows how totalitarian regimes will completely cherry-pick historical models. Hitler ignored Ataturk's actual geopolitical stances, his modernizing values, and his disdain for fascist racism. Instead, the Nazis simply extracted the brutal mechanics of ethnic cleansing to justify their own future atrocities.
Exactly. They strip the history of its context, ignore the complexities of the era, and turn the raw data of human suffering into a blueprint for their own crimes.
This has been an intense deep dive. If you're listening to this, we want to validate your desire to dig into topics this complex, because history is rarely just a clean timeline of what happened. As we've seen today, history is about who gets to write the final peace treaty. It's about the specific words we choose to define the dead, whether a textbook says ethnic cleansing or genocide. And it is about how past atrocities are weaponized by future regimes to justify new horrors.
And before we go, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought from the literature section of our research. There was a Greek novelist named Elias Venesis. He actually survived one of those Ottoman death marches, the Labor Battalions we discussed earlier.
Oh, wow.
Out of the 3,000 people conscripted into his specific labor brigade, he was one of only 23 who survived the ordeal.
23 out of 3,000.
He later wrote a harrowing autobiographical book about his experience titled Number 3132 and 8, which was simply the conscript number the Turkish army assigned to him.
Surviving as 1 out of 3,000, that is just unimaginable.
It is. And decades later, in 1978, a Greek filmmaker turned his survival story into a movie. But here's the catch. Greece itself banned the film from being shown in its own country until 1982.
Greece banned it.
Yes. Why? Because of intense diplomatic pressure from the Turkish Foreign Ministry, who complained the film would ruin Greek-Turkish relations. So I want you to ponder this as we wrap up. What does it say about the fragility of our geopolitical peace when a democratic nation feels forced to censor the harrowing survival stories of its own citizens just to maintain diplomatic relations with a neighbor? That is a phenomenal question to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep reading, keep seeking out multiple perspectives, and keep questioning the history you think you know.